Hello, good day. My name remains Aya Jackson, and I'm super excited. I have here with me today a lecturer and a researcher at the Flinders University, Dr. Ben. Thank you so much for honoring the invitation to come on this podcast today, where we'll be talking about how schools shape bullying. It's such a pleasure to have you here today. I'm so excited. I would like to make an acknowledgement of country before we begin, if you don't mind.
Absolutely. And thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. I would like to acknowledge that we are meeting on the Ghana land and we pay our respects to the elders past and emerging. It's such an honor to have you here today. I'm so glad that you have, an evidence-based background towards this conversation because you have done research work on bullying. In order not to take much of your time, I would like you to just introduce yourself once again to the audience. I'm making this podcast on behalf of the World Changer Parenting Institute, where I'm a founder. And my goal, my aim is to support parents, especially multicultural parents living in Australia. And I know that one of the issues that a lot of families are facing with their children with respect to school is bullying. And I think this conversation is really important. So
Thanks for the introduction. That's really kind. Yeah, look, it's a real pleasure to come on and have a chat about something so important as bullying. You've done a pretty good job of introducing me, so I don't think I've got a lot to say other than one of the fun things I get to do in this job is to teach some social policy topics at Flinders Uni in social work programs and do research on young people and their experience of different forms of social harm, so things like bullying and loneliness, violence. So that's what I'm up to. My background's in youth work and working with young people in a few different contexts, but mainly in alternative education contexts. So that's been a lot of fun as well. Happy to come and have a chat.
thank you so much. And like I told you before, this podcast is basically for parents. And I know that we're trying to discuss on bullying and shaping our conversation to something that is very much relatable to parents. In your research work, I know you've talked about unforeseen effects of bullying, and we understand bullying to be a persistent behavior that humiliates, harasses any individual. And I understand that it's an ongoing and deliberate misuse of power in relationships through repeated actions that intend to cause harm, whether it's physical or emotional or even psychological. Bullying can be associated to the physical aspects where it might involve physical violence or fight. But your research work talks about the unseen effects of bullying. Could you please explain why these effects are predominant? Why should we look into the unseen effects of bullying, and how can we identify bullying that is unseen?
It's a really good question. I hope you don't mind. I've got my cup of tea with me as well while we're chatting, so I might
Oh,
occasionally take a sip.
it's okay.
Yeah, look, it's an interesting problem of bullying and sometimes the way that it can be hard to identify. And you gave a great example of the technical kind of definition of bullying. That's the one that Australia has kind of institutionalized into its national as well as state-based policy. And if you go and talk to a school, or if you look at some of the resources that are available on a national repository called Bullying No Way, then that'll be the definition that you'll find.
Yes.
Intentional misuse of power, intent to cause harm, and there being some sort of repetition part of that as well. And that's a really good starting place for this conversation, because that's a definition of bullying that's going to be around for a few decades, and it's something that has had lots of research done about it. And it's a useful tool to kind of identify when bullying happens.
Yeah.
But some of my research and some others around the world have started looking at bullying from a slightly different perspective. So that definition that you gave was established out of some psychology research, and that approach to it is really focused on behaviors, really, things that are quite visible, like we're talking about. You can see when somebody is doing that to somebody else. Whereas some of this bullying research that's come out of sociology and education and even some sort of philosophical perspectives on it have started saying, well, actually, maybe it's something more than this. Maybe it's not just those physical, tangible actions that we can see, the behaviors, maybe there's something more to bullying than that. And that's where we start thinking about some of the social dynamics. And that's not just in group context, because that initial bullying definition accounts for groups, but maybe we start thinking about organizations. So the school as a whole. How is the school set up and structured? And what are some of the social norms that operate within that? And how might those institutions and norms make it harder to see certain types of bullying than others? So a good example of that is, right, if we watch some media of some sort that's talking about bullying, we probably see a really popular representation is that the bully is somebody who is usually big, right? This large person, and they probably struggle socially or are from a small social kind of clique of some sort, and they go around using their power and their size to intimidate other people. That's kind of what bullying looks like. And that is one picture of it, and that's where that initial definition kind of would pick that up quite easily.
Yeah.
But some of the other research that we're doing suggests that maybe we can also look for things that are students who are popular, students who are really good socially, students maybe even that follow school rules, but they have a way of intimidating, holding power over, or dehumanizing other people. In other words, you kind of think of the popular kid in school who got away with being a bit mean, or got away with treating others not in not really kind ways, or even perhaps where the teacher used that person or the power they had to help control the classroom. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Those things can also be bullying,
Yes.
or at least they're a lot harder to see, but they're also forms of harm. And that's one of the really interesting things about this kind of approach is saying, I'm going to worry less about that technical definition, because when we go and ask students, but even when we go and ask teachers and sometimes parents, they don't always go, well, here's the three things: intent, power imbalance, and repetition. They're actually more worried about the harm.
Yes.
So that's what this approach is doing. It's about saying, okay, let's have a little bit of a broader look to try and understand when young people are going, this is actually not okay. This is somebody getting hurt. That's what we'll include and consider bullying too. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you so much. One of the great impacts that I draw from what you're saying is that it affects not just a child's physical demeanor to relationships, like maybe withdrawing from the class, from some circles of friends in school, but it affects their self-esteem, and that's unseen. It affects their confidence, and all this goes into the systemic structure that in some cases foster bullying. So many parents find it difficult to actually spot the signs of bullying in their children. And for a lot of migrant parents, one of the things that may go unspoken is the issue of maybe having difference in skin tone or in the way you speak. For example, maybe as an Asian family or as an African child who is not very well spoken in English, children are quick to probably tease each other on the playground on some of these things. How can a parent who is not aware, who is not knowledgeable, who probably would even dismiss the child when the child comes home to say, "Oh, I couldn't play today with my friend because for me, back home in Nigeria, my children didn't see themselves as black, as it were." So the first day my children went to school and came back home, and my daughter told me she couldn't play with someone today because the person told her that she was black, and she played with another child who is a person of color. I was like, that's interesting. So we had to have a conversation around color, around bullying, around racism. So for a parent, how do you prepare a child to identify signs of bullying? Easy to say, my child was the one bullied. What if my child is the one bullying?
Yeah, that's really tough, isn't it?
Yes.
Obviously, there's lots of parts to your question. This is a really tricky and challenging issue in general, just because it's about harm and it's about often inequalities and difference, and it's often quite hidden. So it's a very complex space. But at the end of the day, it's about harm. And if somebody's being harmed, then we can do something about that. And unfortunately, one of the patterns that we find with bullying is that any point of difference becomes an opportunity for people to bully in some form.
True.
And that is something that can be attached to identity, it can be something that's cultural, it can be something that's physical, like disability. And those points of difference just give people an avenue to do it, to bully others, to find a way to bring somebody else down, really, to do harm. And so for a parent who knows their child is going to stand out in some way in school, that's really hard. You know that there's an opportunity there, and so you've got to potentially think about, how do I prepare them for that? And then similarly, kind of you ask the question, well, what if your child's the one doing the bullying? What do you do with that? And again, like you know that there's those points of difference that are the opportunity, but we can think a little bit more and think about, well, what's the motivation, or what's underpinning that, what's happening for that child. Because those points of difference are the opportunity, but they're not the reason, if that makes sense.
Yes.
For that alone, there's some motivation as well. So it's really difficult, but my work often comes back to thinking about institutions and social context. So they're the other part to the equation that I think is really important, sometimes kind of overlooked. Sometimes we think about, what's that individual student, what's happening for them, why are they bullying, or what's wrong with them sometimes as well, why they do that. My research comes back and says, well, actually, sometimes it's context that gives the opportunity or the motivation or the reason for bullying as well. So schools are places that are great in terms of the opportunities they offer students. Education is obviously really, really important. Teachers do an amazing job under really difficult circumstances, but those institutions also set up an environment which can create bullying. And not because anybody set out to do it that way, but because that's what we've got. And so an example of that, and I kind of use this to illustrate the hidden bullying thing as well, is there was a young person in one of the research projects I was running who described an experience that they said was like a teacher bullying students. And that sounds terrible, but this is a fairly mild example of that. There are some more extreme ones I won't talk about, but I think this is an interesting one. And so they talked about a classroom where the students were doing a presentation in groups. And so different groups would go to the front of the classroom and they'd do a presentation. And there was a group of boys, she said, up the back of the class who were really loud and disruptive while other people were doing their presentations, which is, of course, not ideal. And then it became that group's turn to do a presentation. And so the teacher said that while they were doing their presentation, she had to kind of control the classroom a bit more. Perhaps they were trying to keep that interest and noise level down. And they went to say we should show the students who are presenting now, show them the respect they deserve. That's a pretty normal kind of classroom norm, if you like. You respect people at the front, show them the respect that they deserve. It sounds like something that perhaps they have as a classroom norm. But the young person telling the story said, well, actually, the teacher stopped halfway through. They went, we should show them the respect that we should show them respect. And they're kind of implying that they didn't deserve respect, that they had been mucking around the back of the class and they'd been disrupting others, and that they didn't deserve respect, but we should give it to them anyway. Now, this story has a couple of layers to it, right? Like, one is respect is a really good value. We should respect each other. We should teach respect. Excellent. No worries. So I'm in agreement with that. We should give to people the respect they deserve, or should we just respect people anyway? I'm not so sure about that. Maybe we should just respect people as a principle, not just because they deserve it as such. But the other part that this young person talked about was, she said that experience for the students who were on the receiving end, the boys who were mucking around, the teacher basically just told the class that they didn't deserve respect. That they just said this and reinforced the norm, and kind of broke that rule of respect in trying to give respect. This is kind of ironical, humorous thing that's happening. So the student said that probably wasn't very nice to be on the receiving end of that. And maybe the teacher could do it for good reason and then trying to control the classroom or whatever. But the student also said that kind of sets up this way of relating to each other. The teachers just said it's okay to treat others this way because they've just modeled that. It's okay to say, these people don't really deserve respect, to pay them out, to play a bit of a joke, and to use humour to control situations and do it at somebody's expense. And that's another interesting part to the bullying that we talk about a lot, is that humour often becomes an excuse. We were only joking. We weren't serious. But that way of deflecting doesn't, again, validate the experience of the people on the receiving end. So that example is a way of showing that those kind of bullying behaviours or ways of dehumanising or devaluing other people happen really easily in a classroom context. where there is a clear person who's in charge of keeping control and power of the situation, the teacher. They have to control the classroom, and one way to do that is to leverage the class as a whole, or the popular students, as a way of keeping control of the naughty or the tricky students. But that sets up this dynamic where students are against each other, teacher against student, and then that we have to have control, and that it's okay to treat each other as well. So
Oh,
that context is part of the picture as to why we get bullied. Again, I recognize that that's kind of a light, low level kind of issue, right? Like it's nobody doing something really horrific, like physically hurting each other or stuff. But if those sort of things compounded and happened all the time, and that was the way we norm behavior, then we can see that there's a problem.
absolutely. Absolutely. And what I hear you say is how every stakeholder, be it a teacher, be it a parent, seamlessly need to be careful of how they are, relating with children, because it's communicating what is approved and what is not appropriate. And like the student told you, I believe that his point is valid, and it's very important for us to pay attention to how we are treating our children, how we are talking to them, how we are acting before them. And so remembering that our actions matter. It's not just talking about the value of respect now. The school can put on its sign and say the value of the school is respect. But how is that respect expressed in the daily activities, in the classroom settings, on the playground, within the homes, in our families? How is that expressed? It's not just about saying it, it's about imbibing the value for what it is, irrespective of the situation. And this calls for not pretending, this calls for not dismissing things that are evidently wrong. And so for me, it points down to the place of values within the society, because yes, children would be children sometimes and act silly, act naughty, act in ways that are unacceptable. But the role that we play as adults is to stand as correctors, those who point them towards the right. And I think it can be a bit tricky, but it's not impossible.
You're right. I find that really interesting. I like the way that you're talking about it, because we often hear this kind of excuse perhaps thrown around, that that's just kids being kids, or that's just the way kids relate to each other, or kids are always mean. We can't ever solve this problem. But I think part of the research I've done as well, particularly around violence, is that children and young people, or you kind of all do, but particularly children and young people, we live out social roles, right? Like we live out the roles that are kind of available to us and modeled to us. And those roles are available to us because we've seen parents, other adults doing and behaving that way. And we think that's a role that we can fulfill because institutions give opportunities. Like, okay, there's this is the kind of thing a popular kid does. This is the kind of thing a socially excluded kid does. These are the kind of responsibilities you might be given, or consequences that come along. If you break like some norms or some rules, you get these kind of consequences. So you live out that expectation. It's kind of like saying often we might know who the class clown is in a classroom. Right? There's that kid who does that, or who the popular kids are, or I could name any other kind of cliche that goes on with that. These are social roles that people live out, and we do them because they're available to us because of the resources we have or the places that we're in. So if we as parents or adults or professionals working in these spaces want to start changing big issues like violence and bullying, then part of what we've got to do is start changing those social roles that are available. What do we do if there's a problem? How do we solve that as a group? What norms do we have? Or if I have an issue that I want to deal with personally, like how do I solve problems? Do I solve problems by fighting, or do I solve problems by talking? Do I solve problems because I've got resources that I can draw on to help me navigate a difficult issue, or do I have to retreat because I don't have access to anybody to help? They're the kinds of things that I think about when I think about the social context and the way we often kind of dismiss or accept certain behaviors.
True. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. It's very important for us to always point ourselves to resources that can help us navigate this difficult situation, because one of the challenge for teachers, for learners, for parents, is really, really identifying the tools and resources that they can bank on to be able to find a way around such a sensitive issue like bullying. And that ignorance is, I wouldn't say most teachers are ignorant, because at least in South Australia, we know that there are policies in place that schools should implement for the no bullying within schools. And for parents, it can be a bit hard because they may not be exposed face to face with these resources. For a person like me who is very passionate, I'm not going out there to find resources to learn. I may never really know how. I will keep dismissing my child. I'll keep saying that's normal. Just thinking up to it, or you have to build the emotional resilience. What does building emotional resilience mean to a child? Yes. So when we're talking about resources and tools that parents can use, can you please talk on that?
For sure. Yeah, look, there are some good tools and resources around. And you're right that in Australia, there is there's school policies, there's an expectation that schools have these processes and policies in place to deal with bullying. So being able to access them is an important thing. The parents know that they can do. There's a couple of ones I'll point to as a really good starting point. So there is a national repository of kind of bullying knowledge and policy in Australia that is set up by the federal government, and it's called Bullying No Way. So we can give you a link to pop in the podcast description. Maybe people want access to that. But there's some really great resources in there for parents, for teachers, for students. There are things to say, okay, as a parent, here's some things you can look out for if you're worried about your student being bullied, with your child being bullied. Here's some things that you can do if you find out that they are. There's other resources there for schools, etc. So that's a really great website, and it sets through some really basic fundamentals, which are really important for parents to know. First being, of course, just listen to your child. Right? Like if your child comes and talks to you about bullying, the best thing an adult and a parent can do is just believe them and listen. There's plenty of research around that shows that what we know about bullying and children is that most of the time they don't report it, or don't report it the first time, or if unlikely to, because there are reasons to not report bullying. For a child, usually those reasons are, hey, I'm worried about it getting worse. Like if I tell somebody, the bullies find out and then they'll kind of bully me for that. Or my parent might come running in and then I'll be embarrassed because they've come in. So there's that, and also this, we have in our Australian culture this idea that we should be able to manage it ourselves. If you're a kid, just kind of toughen up, or just go and tell them to stop. Like these kind of individualized ideas, which are really not helpful either. So there's reasons that they won't. So if they come and talk to you, believe them, listen. That's really, really important. Next thing, of course, is you want to prepare to take some action, but don't do it too quickly. Right? So kind of hear it and then rage out and then run off to the school and call them and tell them all the things they did wrong. Instead, take the time to listen to your child and talk with them about what they want to do. What would they like to do about it? If you want to disagree and say you actually really want to do this thing as well, we'll talk about what they're comfortable doing and what are the steps that they'll give for them to do. So that's really great. You can just take your time, think about it, but then take action. And taking action is really important. If a child comes and tells you about their experience, they want you to do something about it. And the do something about it might be as simple as listen and validate, but hopefully it also is help me stop this from happening. Right? So let's do that part as well. And then parents should really just think about, well, what can you do? And generally speaking, it's probably a bad idea for parents to try and solve the problem directly with the bully, like to go online and make some comment. Don't do that. Don't just go and turn it into an online argument on social media. Even going and approaching other parents can be really, really difficult, because there might be a whole range of reasons at home why this bullying behavior is happening. You might not have the resources and skills to really navigate that. So a really important starting point is to go to the school. Schools, as we said, they should have policy and procedures in place. They should have the resources to help you manage that. That's probably the best starting point. Sometimes schools don't live up to that expectation, and that gets trickier, and that's where you as a parent have to be an advocate for your child. You have to say, okay, this is what's happening. I really want to see a response. And there's some simple things you can do there as well, like ask for the bullying policy and read it and become familiar with it. And then when you go, before you go and talk to them, take down some notes. write some things that you want to say, because then you've got some notes to refer to in case you forget, but also helps you be concise rather than kind of blabbing on like I'm doing now. And then ask what's going to happen and who you can follow up with. Who's going to let me know what's happening, and so that you've got a fairly clear checklist of things that are going to happen. So those things really help. And if you don't get the answer you want, then you can always escalate it, right? Like you can say, okay, I want to meet with initially the classroom teacher, or perhaps a wellbeing person of some sort. It's a really good start. There's usually counsellors or social workers or youth workers in a school. And if you don't get the response you want there, go to the leadership, deputy principal, and then you keep talking to people until you get the response. So there's a couple of resources. How's that sound?
So good, so good. One thing I always say is that as a parent, you are in partnership with the school. And so you cannot leave the entire burden of solving some challenging issues with just the school. You have to be a partner in solving those issues. And I love the points that you have raised. I feel like a lot of times these things are not followed through, because until something really goes bad, where maybe a child begins to be suicidal, that's when we begin to pay attention. But if we are, like you say, can listen, actively listen from the very beginning and walk through that with the child, it wouldn't get to the point where the child is going through some mental health issues. Even if you begin to see those signs, you can provide some kind of first aid as a parent, in being there for the child. So yeah, those points are really, really valid. Thank you for sharing them. Yeah. So, and there are other things I'm really interested in knowing. So when it comes to helping schools create a supportive environment and modeling empathy, modeling emotional resilience, and helping children to feel included in the community. What do you think, or how do you feel about creating a sense of belonging among, maybe in a classroom, for every child? Because like we initially began to say that it's at that point of feeling different, feeling isolated, that bullying can thrive. But if a child feels that sense of belonging, so in what way or what roles do teachers, especially for college students, where it can really be a bit tricky for the teachers, but how can they nurture that communal spirit within the classroom?
So when you say college students, are you thinking secondary schooling, or are you thinking post-schooling? Secondary school.
Secondary school.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, look, I think there's a couple of things to think about. One is it is different with an older age group of students and young people than with a younger group. So it's always important to keep in mind that kind of key of those students, but also the opportunities that we want to give them. So as students get older, of course, they're getting more capable, but getting closer to adulthood, and we want to give more opportunities for them to build their capacity, to take responsibility, and to use the skills that they've got. I think we often underestimate teenagers and the capacity that they've got. The teenagers have and continue to do amazing things in our world that we often don't recognise. We infantilise them, or we teach them like infants. Right? We teach them like little children. But some of the most amazing people I know are young people. They do an incredible job of advocating and changing the world. So we should treat them like leaders in this process rather than just passive recipients of it. You're children, young people, and your teenagers, and say, okay, we know this is something we want. We want to have an inclusive environment in school. So how do you think we can do that? What would you like? Having that sense of ownership and control, then you're already creating that space. So to give you a little bit of a story, there was a group of young people that we were doing some bullying research with, and they were a group that had like a social justice kind of focus. And it was interesting, actually, at the start of the group, there was only a few of them there, and we said, we'd love to have some more. And they went, oh, hang on a minute. And they all ran out of the classroom, and we got a couple of their mates and brought them back, and they joined in the group. So that was excellent. And after doing a series of workshops and focus groups, we were having some conversations with them about bullying. I was doing some interviews following up later. And one of the young people who participated said to me during the interview, was like, oh, I really enjoyed a lot of these conversations, and it really made me think. And I was thinking about my friendship group and how they kind of interact with each other. And I realized that it's fairly normal in our group to kind of pick on each other in a playful way, and that's a very Australian thing as well, is to kind of knock each other and to have this kind of crass sense of humour where we treat each other poorly as a way of showing affection. Weird, but that's Australia, right? And so he kind of recognised this. He said, well, I decided to do something about it. So I just talked to my mates about it. I said, this is something that we do. Can we stop it? Like, can we find other ways to relate to each other? And so they did. And it's like, well, that's amazing. What an incredible outcome. But if we step back a little bit and think about the process that happened there, we didn't have an adult come in and tell some young people, you've got to stop doing this, and we want to build a better culture. Instead, we created a space for these young people to talk about something that was important for them. We said nobody had to participate in this. Come along if you want to. And so they did. And they had conversations about it. And what we did in that space was modelled a process of having conversations. So we created a space where they had control as much as we could about what they wanted to. And so they got comfortable in many ways with doing it. And then they went on and led the next stage themselves. Nobody asked them to do that. Nobody said, right, now go talk to your mates. They just went and did it because they thought after that, that's actually really important. So what we've got here is a process of participation, what we talk about youth participation. Some people will talk about co-design. There are some other names for it, but what we're talking about is giving democratic dialogue opportunities for people to chance to talk about things that are important to them, and then they go and take some action because it's important to them, not because anybody told them. Yeah. So if people wanted to do that with young people, I say get the young people leading, get them involved in it, and then you'll create something that's meaningful for them instead of trying to decide for them.
Yeah. Oh, so good. Absolutely on point. Because, like you said, we underestimate teenagers. However, they are keen on leading. They want to show that they're becoming more independent. They're able to make decisions and problem solve. And so getting them to be active participants, to play an active role in campaigning against bullying, against teasing each other. I think that's so incredible. And nothing can beat the actions that they take, that they initiate by themselves. So having that initiative is one of the most incredible pathways to, resolving this kind of issues in schools. And I feel like really empowering the teenagers to know how to start these conversations among themselves is very paramount. And like you said, yes, we need someone to start the conversation. If an adult, if a teacher, if a parent starts a conversation at home, starts a conversation within the classroom, the children themselves become inspired to talk among themselves, to make corrections, to stand up. And yes, when it comes to bullying, we say that there are different participants, that there are enablers, there are those that are bystanders, and then there are the upstanders. And those are those who stand against anything bullying that they see happening, and they are able to voice, they make their voice known that no, this is not acceptable. And we don't want children to be like negligent. We don't want them to act like it doesn't matter. And so we want to be able to raise independent thinking children. We want to be able to raise children who see a problem and can have a conversation around solving that problem, and also influence themselves, influence their peers. So this is where good influence comes in, as against like peer pressure, right? Yeah, so this is strong points. Thank you for sharing them. Instagram is creating an app for just teenagers now, where parental permissions are put in place and all those kind of things. But how do we really prepare our children against cyberbullying?
This is a really important question. And something that's very current at the moment here in South Australia. There is, I just attended last week, I think, maybe the week before, a social media summit that was here in Adelaide. There was another one in New South Wales because the Premier in South Australia wants to ban young people from getting access to social media before 14. And then there's a bit of a parental consent thing that happens up to 16 years of age. So this is a really complex space in some ways. I think there is evidence to show that social media has a negative impact on people's mental health, but how we approach that with young people is quite interesting. This is obviously something that's targeted at young people, and there's an argument that perhaps their brain development makes them more vulnerable at this stage. But I think there's some challenge here as well about whether we just accept that this space is toxic and that's the way it is, so therefore we just have to ban some people from it, or can we actually start reforming this space, right? So there are things that parents can absolutely do to help them have conversations with their children about how to use social media safely. Point to some of those resources if that's helpful. But
Yeah.
I think there's also a fundamental question here about whether, as a society, as Australia, as the world, are we going to just accept that social media companies get to do whatever they want, or are we going to start asking questions about, well, what is this thing, social media, and what do we really want it to do, and what are some of the things that we think are really just not okay, and maybe we should make it a little bit better. So this is a tough conversation. There's obviously some really loud voices in this space, and people who want particular models of free access to say whatever they like, but I think we can collectively agree that there is some harm being done here, and that maybe there's some better ways to do it. There are some really good resources around, and I've talked about the Bullying No Way website already, so there's some stuff there as well. But there's another one that is on the E-Safety Commission's website.
Okay.
So the E-Safety is, again, a federal government-funded initiative. They have some great resources for parents, and say, here's how you can have a bit of a conversation, here's somewhere to start. Again, I like how sometimes it's really just simple stuff, like you don't have to overcomplicate this. They've got these 3 online safety basics, and they are: be engaged, open, and supportive. So this is the first step for parents, right? Is not to overreact to social media and say, absolutely nothing in our house will be social media, but rather think about it like, okay, how do I have a conversation about this?
Yeah.
How do I stay open? How do I engage with this? Maybe I have to be on social media for something, so you can relate a little bit. Personally, I don't like a lot of social media, but I have to use some for work to promote that. And then when I think about it, I go, actually, there are some platforms that I kind of like watching funny videos on. So I do use a little bit. I can appreciate that. So let's have some open conversation. And there are some parents who I've known who were really open and engaged, and they're the kind of people that I would think were doing an excellent job. And then they come and have a chat one day and say, you know what, there was this one social media thing that I knew nothing about. And that was the one that was causing the problem for my child. Yes. Stay open, keep having the conversation, find out what your children are young people are into, so that you can know a bit about what's going on. The second thing that they say on the E-Safety Commission is set some rules. I kind of like the way that this is framed, because there's a lot of guilt put on parents, right? Like, you shouldn't allow X many hours of screens, or you shouldn't do this, shouldn't do that. But there should be some rules, right? Yes. We should have some expectations around the way that children and young people engage, just like there are rules for us as adults as well. Like, rules are part of life. Let's talk about what they should be. Let's try and make some reasonable expectations and work out what works for your family and what things you're worried about, what things do harm. Let's set some rules around that. So set some rules. I kind of like that on as well.
Yeah.
And then the last one is about using safety features and settings. So again, this is kind of reflective of the first two, because you have to kind of get to know the stuff a little bit to be able to use it. And then you have to set some rules around it. But there are safety features. Like what you said, there are some versions of apps that are just children. And so maybe that's the place to go. Or there are other ways to tie down, lock down the way, how much they can communicate, or when they can communicate, or who with. Those kind of things are worth thinking about too.
Absolutely. Incredible wisdom parents need to glean and act upon. And I like that you kind of simplify it. The methodology is so simplified that if parents would only pay attention and follow through, we'll be avoiding a lot of issues for our children. Wow, I really feel very honored to have you here today. What should we focus on as a society to build a bully-free environment? Maybe how collaborate together, parents, children, the schools, understanding how schools shape bullying. How can we ensure that we are making it, much more welcoming, create that sense of belonging where everyone can be kind to one another? What word would you give to every one of us?
That's a really tough question, isn't it? What's the one thing to solve this really big issue?
Well, it doesn't have to be one thing.
Okay, great.
Yeah, like your final words.
Oh, look, obviously my expertise is in working with young people, and that's what I'm really interested in. So it's my youth work background, and now I'm a sociologist who does that work with the young
Yeah.
people. So my first answer is always going to be get young people involved. Right? That
Mm.
it's really important that we're going to try and solve issues for
Mm.
young people, that they lead that process. There's
Thank you for
no
saying
point in
that.
us
Mm.
just going in and saying, we've got the solution. And there's a number of times that I've been to events, etc., where young people who are there come away saying, "Oh, that just sounded like a bunch of old people talking about stuff, talking about youth issues."
Yeah.
Sorry, so that's the way it goes. But yeah, let's get them involved, get them leading, give them some sense of ownership over it. Find out what the issue actually looks like for them as well. We talked
Yeah.
about technical definitions versus harm, and that's a result of adults running off and doing all this research and saying things that make sense to them, kind of losing sight of what's really important for young people. And I say losing sight because sometimes those stuff can be done really well intended, but also they can be really well engaged with young people. But time moves on and a new generation comes through and their experiences are different. And so we have to keep coming back to young people and saying, great, okay, what does it mean for you? What does it look like
Mm.
in your experience? How's it different now that social media exists? How's
Mm.
it different now that these kind of inequalities exist in our society that weren't perhaps highlighted as much before? And now what do we need to think about instead? And so that's all eternal source of wisdom, is to go to the people who were affected most, right, and ask them what they think. That would be my starting point. And then the only other thing I would say is this is a complex problem. Let's think about it from multiple perspectives. Let's get as many different ideas in the room as we can. This isn't going to be solved just by focusing on one little thing. It's about individuals, social context, social structures. We need a full multidisciplinary perspective.
There's a connection between bullying and youth violence because if it is perpetrated over time, people become violent. Yes. So just in case a parent has a child whose youth is, it's so bad, is now very violent, how can we say, okay, this child is actually that violent? Is there like a definite definition or are there some identifiers?
It's a good question, yeah. But I would answer that by saying there's probably a couple of things that are very similar to the conversation that we've been having. There are likely to be definitions of violence in institutions like schools or other places and in law, etc. And that's all really useful for those purposes. Like if you want to stop violence in schools, then you need to go and have a conversation with the school. There are obviously legal definitions and legal implications to things that people do. But my consistent experience is that when we talk to young people, what they're most interested in is when people are getting harmed and trying to prevent that. Violence for some people is a way of solving problems, and I don't say that really flippantly, like that's silly of them to reuse that thing. But in their context, that's really important and meaningful because that's what's available. That's the culture. That's their experience, and to just suddenly turn off a tap of saying you can't use this way to solve your problems anymore, to blame individuals for that is really unfair. Instead, it's always important to think about context. And one of the ways to think about violence is that there are kind of multi layers to it. There's individual violence, which we see, the more physical thing, and then the more less visible ones. This is coming right back to what we started with, the invisible forms of bullying, where there are systems of inequality that set some groups against others, that violate people, not just violence in a physical sense, but violation because their rights are being trampled on, or they live in poverty and so they don't have access to the same services or the same opportunities as others. And then on top of that sort of systemic or structural forms of violence, there are kind of cultural forms of violence. And I say cultures not to mean individual cultures or whole cultures, but ideas and rationales and justifications that form part of culture. Like in our culture, we celebrate some forms of violence, which sounds insane. And I don't just mean necessarily like war and that sort of stuff, but I mean things like entertainment.
Yeah.
There are so many movies and stories that we tell in our culture that congratulate and celebrate people who use violence over others. And there are endless amounts of sports that are about competitive humiliation of another person or physical intimidation and domination. And there are parts of our institutions like politics that celebrate those things as well. So if we want to think about those big issues like violence, we kind of have to take the broad view, I think, and start thinking about all those different parts. Sorry, that went off on a big tangent. I hope that helps answer your question.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. I have gleaned so much wisdom from you today. And I believe that anyone who listens to this podcast will find it extremely useful. It's quite practical. There are action steps that they can take after listening to this. And I don't know, there's nothing more I can say. You've said it all. Thank you so much for sharing your time, for sharing your wisdom with us. It means so much to me. I'm very grateful. Thank you. And
Thanks for the
so,
invitation. It's been good to chat.
yeah. I know you're on Twitter and I also know you have a podcast. So would you please share your handle with us?
For sure. Yeah, look, it's probably just really easy just to Google my name. So Ben Lohmeyer. And if you look up Twitter or I think LinkedIn, or you'll just even find the university profile page, and then it's kind of all the links will be there. And you can check out the podcast, which is just called Making and Breaking Social Policy. I promise it's not quite as boring as it sounds. Social policy, a lot of social work students come in going, this topic's going to suck. But it's really just a conversation about big ideas and big issues. So
Yeah.
that's what that's about.
Yeah, it's really been very eye-opening for me listening to the podcast. It's been enriching. Thank you for all that you do. It's pushing social workers, people like me, to look at, how can I be a part of the solution and not just keep talking about all the problems in the world. Thank you so much. And so we have come to the end of this podcast for today. Amazing.